Sound of a crackling fire and a slow, ominous melody begins and fades slightly into the background. Welcome to Tales from the Dark Room. Settle in and try to ignore the creaks in the floorboards and the shadows dancing just at the edge of your sight. Tonight's story is a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying thing in the world is the sound of your own voice. Her name was Annika, and she lived on the 7th floor of a building that felt older than the city itself. It was one of those nights where the rain didn't just fall. It clawed at the windows and the wind howled like a hungry animal. Annika was curled up on her sofa, lost in a book, the world outside a distant, blurry mess. The only light came from a single lamp, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed on the walls. It was well past midnight. Her building had a rule about late-night noise, so the silence was absolute, broken only by the storm and the rhythmic ticking of her grandfather clock. That's when her phone, lying screen down on the coffee table, began to vibrate. It buzzed against the wood, a jarring, angry sound in the quiet apartment. She sighed, annoyed. Who would be calling at this hour? A wrong number, probably. She reached for it, her fingers tracing the smooth glass before flipping it over, and then she froze. The screen glowed with an incoming call, but the name displayed was simply Annika, and beneath it, her own number. For a moment she just stared, her mind struggling to process the impossibility of it. It had to be a glitch, a weird bug in the system. Her thumb hovered over the red decline button. A part of her, the logical part, screamed that this was just a technical error. But another part, a colder, more primal instinct, felt a spike of pure dread. The phone continued its relentless buzzing. Curiosity, that dangerous, nagging human trait, got the better of her. With a trembling hand, she swiped to answer, her heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She held the phone to her ear, but said nothing. The line was silent, except for a faint, staticky hiss, like a radio tuned between stations. "Hello?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. The static crackled, and then a voice answered. A voice she knew better than any other in the world. It was her own. It was a perfect replica, down to the slight lisp she had when she was nervous. But this voice was different. It was thin, ragged, and filled with a terror so profound it made the hairs on her arms stand on end. "Annika," her own voice pleaded, "listen to me. You have to listen to me very carefully." Annika's breath caught in her throat. She tried to speak, to ask who this was, how this was possible, but no sound would come out. "Don't open the door," the voice on the phone whispered, a frantic, desperate edge to it. "No matter what you hear, no matter what you think you see, do not open the door." Before Annika could even begin to form a question, it happened. A sharp, distinct knock echoed from her front door. It wasn't the loud, aggressive knock of a stranger, but a soft, almost polite tap, 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 tap. It was the kind of knock a neighbor might make, but it was almost 1 in the morning. Her neighbors were all asleep. Her blood ran cold. On the other end of the phone, the voice that sounded exactly like hers began to hyperventilate, the panic escalating with every ragged breath. "Oh no," it sobbed. "It's here. Annika, please, I'm begging you, don't let it in." Annika stood frozen in the middle of her living room, the phone pressed hard against her ear. The knocking came again, a little louder this time, more insistent. "Annika?" a voice called from the hallway. And her heart stopped. It was her voice, a calm, friendly, perfectly normal version of her own voice. "Annika, honey, I forgot my keys. Can you let me in?" On the phone, her other self was screaming now, a raw, terrified shriek. "That's not me! Annika, don't listen to it, it's a trick!" The voice from the hallway sounded mildly annoyed. "Annika, come on, it's pouring out here. Stop playing games and open the door." Annika's world was spinning. 2 versions of herself, one on the phone, lost in a storm of terror, the other waiting patiently outside her door. Her mind was a battlefield. One of them was lying. One of them was not her. She crept towards the door, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. The phone was still glued to her ear, the voice on it now just a string of desperate, broken sobs. "Please, please, please don't open it." She reached the door and leaned her forehead against the cool wood, her body trembling. The knocking escalated, no longer polite. It was a hard, rhythmic pounding. Bang, bang, bang. "Annika, open this door right now," the voice from the hallway commanded, its friendly tone gone, replaced with a chilling authority. She couldn't breathe. Her hand hovered over the deadbolt. What was real? The terrified woman on the phone, or the irritated woman locked outside? Summoning a courage she didn't know she possessed, she stood on her tiptoes and peered through the peephole. For a second, she saw nothing but the dimly lit, empty hallway. A wave of relief washed over her. Maybe it was just a prank, a sick, elaborate prank. But then, a shape moved into view, stepping directly in front of her door. It was a woman. It was her. Staring right back at her through the distorted lens of the peephole was her own face. Her hair was matted with rain. Her expression was one of cold, flat impatience. It was her face, her eyes, her mouth. But there was nothing behind the eyes, just a hollow, terrifying emptiness. A scream tore from Annika's throat. She stumbled back, dropping the phone. It clattered to the floor, but she could still hear the tiny, distant sound of her own voice screaming in unison with her. On the other side of the door, the pounding became a furious, animalistic assault. The entire doorframe shuddered with the force of the blows. "Let me in!" The thing with her face roared, its voice a guttural, inhuman sound now. Annika scrambled backward, crawling away from the door as it splintered and cracked under the onslaught. She pressed herself into the far corner of the room, making herself as small as possible. The two sounds filled the apartment, a terrifying duet of her own voice. One, a scream of pure animal terror from her own lungs. The other, a demonic, enraged roar from the other side of the door. They were both her. They were both happening at once. The next morning, the neighbors on the 7th floor spoke in hushed, frightened tones. They told the police about the noise. It wasn't just the sound of the door being broken down. It was the screaming. They all said the same, impossible thing. They had heard Annika screaming, but it wasn't coming from one place. They said it sounded like two people, both with Annika's voice screaming at the exact same time, from two different places in her apartment at once. One scream from near the door, and another from the farthest corner of the room. When the police finally forced their way in, the apartment was empty. The door was smashed, hanging off its hinges. The only thing they found was a cell phone lying on the floor, its screen shattered. The call log showed the last call received was from Annika's own number. The call was still connected, and from the phone's tiny speaker, if you listened very, very closely, you could still hear the faint, desperate sound of someone whispering, "Don't let it in. You've made it through this tale, but the dark room is never empty. Another story waits. Another shadow watches." Subscribe to Tales from the Dark Room and turn on your notifications. You wouldn't want to miss our next story, or the knock on your own door. Thank you for listening. Welcome to Tales from the Dark Room, where shadows breathe, whispers follow, and every story drags you deeper into the dark. Keep the lights on, if you dare. The engine of the old city bus coughed and sputtered, a familiar, weary sound that echoed through the deserted streets. It was just past midnight, and Leo was on his final run, the infamous Night Route 33. He knew this route like the back of his hand. Every pothole, every flickering streetlight, every shadow that danced just beyond the glow of his headlights. Tonight, the fog was thick, clinging to the windows like a damp shroud, making the world outside feel distant and unreal. As he pulled up to the first stop, a small group of 10 figures huddled under the dim yellow light, their faces obscured by the mist. One by one they shuffled on, dropping coins into the fare box with a hollow clink. 10 passengers. He counted them, a ritual he'd developed over years of late-night driving. 10 souls to deliver into the heart of the sleeping city. He pulled the lever, the doors hissed shut and the bus groaned back into motion, plunging into the foggy abyss. Leo drove in a comfortable silence, the only sounds being the hum of the engine and the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the mist. He glanced at the long, rectangular rear-view mirror above his head, another old habit. He saw his 10 passengers scattered throughout the bus like lonely chess pieces. A woman with a tired face, clutching a worn-out briefcase. A young man with headphones, his head bobbing to a silent beat. An elderly couple holding hands, their heads resting against the vibrating glass. 10 familiar silhouettes of the night. He focused back on the road, navigating a sharp turn that led down a particularly dark stretch of road, bordered by a dense, unlit park on one side and skeletal industrial buildings on the other. The headlights barely pierced the gloom. Something made him glance back at the mirror. A flicker of movement, a trick of the light, maybe. He looked again, more carefully this time. His heart gave a sudden hard jolt against his ribs. He counted. 1, 2, 3, 9, 10, 11. 11. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, thinking the exhaustion was finally getting to him. He counted again, his breath catching in his throat. There were undeniably 11 figures reflected in the glass. The 11th passenger was in the very back row, a space that had been empty just moments before. He squinted, trying to make out the details, but the figure was shrouded in the deepest shadows of the bus, a void in human form. A cold sweat began. New. As the bus passed under a rare, functioning streetlight, a sliver of sickly orange light cut through the interior. For a terrifying second, it illuminated the back row. What Leo saw made the air freeze in his lungs. The 11th passenger, its head was twisted completely backward, facing the rear window, but its body was facing forward. And from that inverted head, a wide, unnatural grin was stretched across its face, its teeth glinting in the fleeting light. It was looking right at him, not at his reflection, but at him. The grin was a silent, mocking scream in the darkness. Leo's hands trembled so violently he could barely keep the bus on the road. He wanted to slam on the brakes, to scream, to run, but he was paralyzed, trapped in his driver's seat like an insect in a web, with that horrifying, grinning visage burned into his mind. The bell chimed, a shrill, piercing sound that shattered the suffocating tension. The next stop. Leo's heart leaped with a desperate hope. Someone would get off. The spell would be broken. He pulled the bus over, his movements jerky and robotic. The doors hissed open, letting in a gust of cold, damp air. He waited, his eyes glued to the mirror. He saw the passengers stir, but no one stood up. No one moved toward the exit. They just sat there, their faces blank, as if they were all in a trance. He stared at them, his fear giving way to a creeping dread that felt like spiders crawling up his spine. The bell hadn't been for a passenger. The doors hung open, inviting the empty, foggy night into the bus. He glanced back at the rearmost seat. The figure was gone, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. For a moment, a wave of dizzying relief washed over him. It was a hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by too many long nights. He was about to pull the lever to close the doors when his eyes caught something. A dark stain. On the vinyl of the back seat, where the grinning entity had been sitting, was a large wet patch. It was a deep, glistening crimson, soaking into the cracks of the seat and dripping slowly, methodically, onto the floor. It wasn't water. It was blood. The sun rose on a quiet, foggy morning, its weak rays struggling to burn through the haze. A highway patrol car, on its routine morning sweep, slowed to a stop. Ahead, parked haphazardly on the shoulder of the deserted road, was City Bus 33. Its engine was cold, its lights were off, and its doors were wide open, gaping like a silent mouth. The officer approached cautiously, calling out, "Hello, everything all right?" There was no answer. He stepped onto the bus. It was completely empty. Not a single passenger was on board. The interior was pristine, except for the driver's area. Papers were scattered on the floor, and a half-full thermos of coffee had been knocked over, its contents staining the mat. And on the driver's seat, placed neatly in the center, was a worn, familiar driver's cap. Of Leo, there was no sign. He had vanished. The bus, his 10 passengers, and the night itself had swallowed him whole, leaving behind only his cap, the lingering smell of stale coffee, and a single dark red stain on the rearmost seat that would never quite wash out. You've survived, this time. But the dark room never stays empty for long. The next story is already waiting, lurking just out of sight. Subscribe to our channel and ring that bell for more tales from the shadows. Don't get left behind before the next shadow finds you. Welcome to Tales from the Dark Room, where shadows breathe, whispers follow, and every story drags you deeper into the dark. Keep the lights on, if you dare. Tonight's story is about a place that was supposed to be a home away from home, a sanctuary for learning. But the old Blackwood Hall dormitory, perched on a windswept hill far from the nearest town, held secrets darker than its unlit corridors. For generations, students had whispered about strange noises, about the feeling of being watched, about a chilling draft that had nothing to do with the poorly sealed windows. But this year it was different. This year, the whispers had a voice. It started subtly, a faint murmur like the wind sighing through the eaves. A student studying late in the common room would pause, thinking they heard their name. They'd look up, see only empty chairs and flickering fluorescent lights, and dismiss it as exhaustion. But soon it became impossible to ignore. The whispers grew bolder, clearer, slithering out from the deep shadows of the hallways after midnight. They were never a shout, always a soft, intimate sound, like someone leaning in close, their breath cold on your ear. Students started talking, first in hushed tones, then in frantic groups. "Did you hear that?" one would ask, eyes wide. "It sounded like it was right outside my door." The bravest among them would crack their doors open, peering into the oppressive darkness of the corridor. They saw nothing. They heard nothing. But the moment the door clicked shut, the whispers would return, more insistent, more personal. The walls themselves seemed to be speaking, weaving a tapestry of fear that wrapped around the entire building. The air grew heavy, thick with a silent dread that sleep could not erase. Every creak of the old building, every rustle of leaves against the window pane became a source of terror. No one felt safe. No one felt alone. Among the terrified students was a boy named Leo. He was a pragmatist, a skeptic, who always looked for the logical explanation. He believed it was a prank, a convoluted trick played by some upperclassmen with too much time on their hands. "It's just the pipes," he'd say, or "it's the wind playing tricks on us." But even he couldn't deny the bone-deep chill that accompanied the sounds. The whispers weren't random, they were articulate, and they were getting clearer with each passing night. Frustrated and determined to expose the prank, Leo decided he needed proof. One evening, armed with his smartphone, he announced his plan to a small group huddled in his room. "I'm going to record it," he declared. "Once we have evidence, we can take it to the dean. This has to stop." His friends were hesitant. "What if it's not a prank, Leo?" whispered a girl named Clara, her face pale. "What if it's something else?" But Leo was resolute. Just after midnight, when the dormitory had fallen into a tense, fragile silence, he propped his phone on his desk, aimed its microphone towards his closed door, and hit record. He sat on his bed, listening, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. For an hour, there was nothing but the ambient hum of the old building. He started to feel foolish. Then it came. A soft, sibilant sound, so faint he almost missed it. A whisper. It was closer this time, clearer. It sounded like it was right outside his door. It spoke a single word, a name. Mia. The next morning, the dorm was in an uproar. Mia, a quiet art student from the second floor, was gone. Her bed was neatly made, her books stacked on her desk, but she was nowhere to be found. The resident advisor assured everyone she had probably just gone home for the weekend without telling anyone. But Mia's roommate swore she had been there when she went to sleep. A cold knot of fear tightened in Leo's stomach. He rushed back to his room, his hands shaking as he grabbed his phone. He plugged in his earbuds, isolating himself from the growing panic outside his door, and played the recording. He skipped forward to the 1-hour mark. There it was, the whisper. He turned the volume all the way up. It was chillingly clear. "Mia!" The voice was raspy, ancient, a dry rustle of dead leaves. It wasn't human. It was something else, something that had no business being in their world. A wave of nausea washed over him. This wasn't a prank. This was real. He listened again and again, the single terrifying word echoing in his head. That night, the dormitory was a fortress of fear. Students pushed dressers against their doors. No one slept. They listened, waiting. And just as before, after the clock struck midnight, the whispers came. This time, they called a different name. Ben. The following day, Ben was gone. Panic erupted. The story of Leo's recording spread like wildfire. The dean was called, parents were notified, but no one had any answers. It was impossible. 2 students couldn't just vanish into thin air, but they had. The pattern was undeniable, a horrifying equation of terror. The whisper called a name, and by morning that person was gone. The dormitory became a ghost town as students fled, packing their bags in a frenzy. But some, like Leo, were trapped, their homes too far away, their parents unreachable. The remaining students huddled together in the common room, refusing to be alone, their faces etched with a primal fear. Leo felt a terrible weight of responsibility. His recording held the key, the proof, but it was also a curse. He knew he had to listen again. He had to know if he'd missed something, any other clue that could explain the horror unfolding around them. He needed a better listen, away from the panicked chatter of the others. He found a small, empty study room in the basement, a place no one ever used. The air was cold and damp. He sat at a dusty table, the single bare bulb overhead casting long, dancing shadows. His hands trembled as he pressed play. He listened to the recording, the silence punctuated only by the distant hum of the building's boiler, and then the whisper. "Mia." He held his breath. He strained his ears, listening past the name, listening to the static, the silence that followed. And that's when he heard it. It was almost imperceptible, a ghostly echo trailing the first name, a second whisper, buried. Lights of a town he knew he would never reach. Back in the basement study room, the phone lay on the floor, its screen glowing softly in the dark. The recording timer ticked upward, capturing the profound, empty silence. After several minutes, a new sound broke the quiet. A soft, wet, dragging noise. It grew closer, accompanied by a faint, dry rustle. Then, a new voice spoke, right next to the phone's microphone. It wasn't a whisper. It was a low, guttural chuckle, a sound of ancient satisfaction. The dragging stopped. A moment passed, and then a new whisper, clear as a bell in the silent room, named its next victim. The phone kept recording, a silent witness in an empty room, documenting the next name on a list that would never end. But Leo, like the others, was never seen again. You've survived, this time. But the dark room never stays empty for long. Subscribe before the next shadow finds you. Welcome to Tales from the Dark Room, where shadows breathe, whispers follow, and every story drags you deeper into the dark. Tonight, we'll talk about Rhea, a lover of all things old and forgotten. She believed every antique held a story. Little did she know the one she was about to find would be her last. So dim the lights, if you dare. Let's begin. The flea market was a chaotic symphony of chatter and clutter, a treasure trove for someone like Rhea. She navigated through stalls overflowing with dusty relics and forgotten trinkets, her eyes scanning for something special. And then she saw it. Tucked away in a dimly lit corner, leaning against a pile of moth-eaten carpets, was a mirror. It was large and oval, framed in ornate, tarnished silver that coiled like slumbering serpents. The glass itself was strangely dark, almost like looking into a pool of still black water. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient. The seller, a man with eyes that seemed to have seen too much, gave her a strange look when she pointed to it. That one? It's been here for years. Nobody ever wanted it, he grumbled, wiping his hands on a grimy cloth. Gives me the creeps. His warning only intrigued Rhea more. She haggled briefly, but the man seemed eager to be rid of it, practically giving it away. As she carried her new treasure home, she couldn't shake the feeling that the air around the mirror was colder, heavier, as if she were carrying a piece of the night itself. Back in her cozy apartment, the mirror looked magnificent. She hung it on the main wall of her bedroom, opposite her bed. It dominated the room, its dark surface reflecting a distorted, shadowy version of her cheerful decor. She smiled at her reflection, pleased with her find, but the smile that looked back at her seemed off. Just for a fraction of a second, it lingered a moment too long after her own had faded. She blinked, shaking her head. It must have been a trick of the light, the strange, rippling quality of the old glass. But a tiny seed of unease had been planted. The first few days were normal, or so she told herself, but the oddities grew, becoming too frequent to ignore. She'd be brushing her hair, and her reflection's hand would move a split second slower than her own. She'd glance at it while getting ready for work, and the reflection would be staring intently at a corner of the room she wasn't looking at. The most unsettling moments were the smiles. Sometimes when her back was turned, and she caught a glimpse of the mirror from the corner of her eye, she'd see the reflection smiling a wide, knowing grin, even when she was feeling anxious or tired. It was a cold, predatory smile that didn't belong on her face. She tried to rationalize it. Stress, lack of sleep, and overactive imagination fueled by her love for spooky things. She even covered the mirror with a sheet for a night, but the feeling of being watched was so intense she couldn't sleep. She felt foolish, but she couldn't deny the creeping dread that filled her own home. The mirror was no longer just a piece of furniture, it was a presence. Then came the knocking. It was late, well past midnight. A storm raged outside, rain lashing against her window pane. Rhea was curled up in bed trying to read when she first heard it. A soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It was faint, almost lost beneath the sound of the storm. She held her breath, listening. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from the door or the window. She slowly lowered her book, her eyes darting around the room. The sound was coming from the wall where the mirror hung. No, not the wall. Her blood ran cold as she realized the sound was coming from inside the mirror. Tap, tap, tap. It was delicate, almost polite, like a visitor gently knocking on a pane of glass, asking to be let in. Or, she thought with a surge of pure terror, asking to be let out. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She stared at the dark, unblinking surface of the mirror. In the dim light, she could just make out her own pale, terrified face. Her reflection stared back, and in the faint light from her bedside lamp, Rhea saw it slowly raise a hand and press its palm flat against the glass from the other side. And then it smiled, that wide, chilling smile. It was waiting. Sleep was impossible. She spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner of her living room, a blanket pulled tight around her, flinching at every creak of the old building, and every rumble of thunder. She refused to go back into the bedroom. The knocking had stopped around 3 a.m., but the silence that followed was somehow worse. She decided then and there. First thing in the morning, the mirror had to. One of them knelt to pick up the largest remaining shard of the mirror. It was a jagged triangle of glass, about the size of her hand. As she looked into it, she gasped and dropped it. The others rushed over. Peering into the shard, they saw it too. It wasn't their own reflection they saw in the dark, silvery depths. It was Rhea. She was standing in a room that looked like a shadowy, twisted version of her own. The colors all wrong, the light dim and grey. And she was looking right out at them. A wide, empty, permanent smile was plastered on her face. Her eyes, however, were screaming. She was trapped, a silent prisoner in a world of glass, forever smiling from her eternal dark room. You've survived. This time. But the dark room never stays empty for long. The shadows are always looking for a new story, a new voice to silence. Thank you for listening. If you made it this far, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the dark. You wouldn't want the next shadow to find you alone, would you? Welcome to Tales from the Darkroom, where shadows breathe, whispers follow, and every story drags you deeper into the dark. Keep the lights on, if you dare. Tonight's story is called The Last Broadcast. The world outside Aaron's window had vanished. One moment the city hummed with the electric pulse of midnight. The next, an absolute suffocating silence fell. A power outage. The darkness was so complete it felt solid, pressing in on him from all sides. Aaron, alone in his small apartment, fumbled for his phone, its flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the black. It was dead. Of course. He navigated by memory, his hands tracing the familiar outlines of furniture until he reached the dusty bookshelf in the corner. There it was, his grandfather's old radio. A relic from a bygone era with its heavy wooden casing and a large circular dial that glowed faintly in the dark. He hadn't touched it in years. Tonight, though, its potential to break the oppressive silence was a lifeline. He clicked it on. A low hum, then static. Aaron twisted the dial slowly, the needle inching across frequencies that were nothing but a sea of white noise. He was about to give up when a voice cut through the hiss. It wasn't instinct was to laugh it off as some late-night prank, a Halloween broadcast played out of season. But the voice, it felt too real, too close. Curiosity, that old and treacherous human trait, began to gnaw at him. What could possibly be out there? His apartment was on the 3rd floor. It was just a blackout, wasn't it? He tried to resist. He really did. He focused on the glowing dial of the radio, on the grain of the wood beneath his fingertips. But the window, a large dark rectangle on the far wall, called to him. The warning had planted a seed of dread, and the only way to uproot it was to prove it wrong. Taking a slow, deep breath, he rose from his chair. His feet made no sound on the carpeted floor as he crossed the room. The static on the radio seemed to get louder, a frantic, hissing chorus in his ears. He reached the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. He told himself it was ridiculous. He was a grown man afraid of a ghost story on an old radio. With a final, defiant thought, he pulled back the edge of the curtain just a fraction. And he saw it. Standing in the street below, directly under a dead streetlight, was a figure. It was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs elongated to an unnatural degree. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, its form a pitch-black silhouette against the lesser dark of the city. Aaron felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. Its stillness was predatory, patient. He felt its gaze on him, even from 3 stories up, even without being able to see its face. He let the curtain fall, his hand trembling. He stumbled back, his mind racing to rationalize what he had seen. A trick of the light, a shadow cast by a tree he'd never noticed before. The voice from the radio cut through his panicked thoughts, sharper this time, more urgent. "You looked, didn't you?" Aaron's blood ran cold. It was impossible. How could it know? "It knows you've seen it now," the whisper hissed, devoid of any sympathy. It was now a statement of fact. "Its game has begun. Listen to me, and listen carefully. Your life depends on it. Do not blink. Do not blink." The command was even more insane than the first. Aaron's eyes were already starting to burn, watering from the strain of staring into the darkness, from the sheer terror of it all. He squeezed them shut for a split second, a reflexive, involuntary action. A mistake. When he opened them, the shadow was no longer in the street. It was inside the room. It stood in the far corner by the door, consuming the little light that filtered in from the moon. It was closer now, and he could see, or rather not see. Where its face should have been, there was nothing, just a void, a patch of perfect, absolute blackness that seemed to drink the light around it. It didn't have eyes, but he felt its attention, a cold, heavy pressure on his soul. The room grew colder, the very air thinning as if being sucked into that faceless void. He was paralyzed, pinned in place by a fear so profound it transcended screaming. He could only stare, his eyes wide and burning, as the figure took a slow, silent step towards him. And another. It didn't walk. It glided, its form seamless and fluid, a ripple in the fabric of reality. The radio crackled one last time. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a flat monotone, devoid of all emotion. A final pronouncement. "This is your last broadcast." The radio died. The static, the hum, the faint glow of the dial, all extinguished, plunging the room and Aaron into a final, suffocating silence. He was alone with the thing in the dark. The sun rose the next morning, flooding the apartment with golden light. The power was back on. Everything was as it should be, except for one thing. Aaron was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken furniture, no forced entry. It was as if he had simply evaporated. The only thing out of place was the old radio, sitting silently on the bookshelf. As the first police officer entered the next shadow finds you.